I've created the scene to better demonstrate exactly what presence does, or just the kind of things you can do with it for controlling ecosystems. And in the scene, what I have is a procedural terrain that is creating kind of a flower box. And then using a variation from the noise generating that, I was able to distribute the presence of several flower varieties. Let's go ahead and just take a look. I'm just using a sand material for the wood, so it's not going to look great, or not look exactly like wood, but I'll go ahead and render this out. You can take a look. So you can see in each one of the sections we have a different flower type for the most part. I would need to do a little more variation, which I'll be showing, adding more species and then being able to get rid of a lot of these white similar blocks showing up. But I'm going to start by kind of destroying this ecosystem so that we can take a look at how it's created. You can go ahead and load this file in, understanding presence. And it does have a few cornucopia items, which would be the yellow flower. Actually, I think that's the only one. So if you don't have the fresh flower bundle, then you can just ignore the item and use a different flower type. So what I'm going to do is just delete this layer. Click OK. And let's take a look at the terrain. The procedural terrain. And if we take a look at the altitude reduction, I have two different noise types. One controlling the altitude, and the other being sent out to the material. Now the reason I'm creating this within the terrain to control the material is because the coordinate systems are going to change, and it's just going to be much easier to get an exact match. So I'm using just a noise node you can add in, and I'm using distributed patterns square samples. Now the way this is set up, I'll go ahead and bring in my function output observer. What we can do is remove the randomness, and then I have the samples set to 1 per cell. And then changing the shape, go to cube, adjust the size to create that same sort of setup. Depending on what settings you have, you can get different variations. Set fine maximums. If the size isn't changed enough, it's going to overwrite itself. Randomness is going to start to mix the blocks together. And you can also set up a random altitude. Now, for the box, it's just basically trying to get as equal of a map as possible. And in order to avoid tearing with this kind of a setup for the terrain, because these edges can often tear the terrain because of the way the polygon structure is. Basically, we have a lot of triangles, and if this edge happens to fall between those triangles, going vertically, and there being no descent, it will just completely tear the mesh. And it may not look bad directly at the polygons, but the shaders would just be destroyed. So what I decided to use was the round pyramid, as opposed to cube, which you can already see the tearing within the output observer. And that's exactly how it's going to look when it renders. And no matter what you do with the material, there's really no way to get around that. If you take a look in the node preview, you can also see that showing up. And it's just the way this isn't really designed to create this kind of displacement where it's a 90-degree angle. So instead, what we have to do is use something rounded, and then I'm using the smooth map to clip off some of the top parts, because otherwise it's going to go down really deep into that pyramid shape, which is what, if you're looking for that, then that's the way you achieve it. But otherwise, what you can do is clip it out. We could bring it in further if we wanted to, negative 0.5. Eventually, it will reach a point where it will become too harsh of an angle and start to tear again. So you just got to be careful of that when you're using this technique. So that's just the way the terrain is generated. So what I did was take this noise, just click into an open area, and add another noise to duplicate it. And I set up a few variations. Well, first I added custom dependency output. So you right-click, add output node custom dependency. And then you can rename it whatever you want. So we can say box mat, and I have that connected to the one I already created. And some of the other options that are available are the random altitudes. And if we want to take a look at what this actually looks like, we just go ahead and connect it. You can turn off find maximums. And now we really don't have a whole lot of variation because we don't have enough samples. So right now we only have one sample per cell. Since the randomness amount is set to 0, there's going to be complete overlapping, and you're not going to see any offset. So we can add more samples. We could do 1 to 4, and that's going to give us a lot more variation. Since we're not worried about creating geometry out of this, just controlling it and the ecosystem, we can now switch this over to cube. And I am going to adjust the auto fit so that we can really see the height differences. And basically, each one of these cubes is going to define a different ecosystem instance, so whichever is in the population list. Every height variation represents a number to control presence. So as long as we have an object, a plant, or a rock within the ecosystem amount, -1 to +1, and the more we have, the more variations we can have, we will get a population for each cube. Once again, we don't really have to worry about the tearing for this instance. I just wanted to make sure that I created it in the terrain editor, like I said, just to make sure that the materials matched up, because we can easily just pass the information through the graph. So I'm going to reconnect this. And it's a good idea, too, to make sure that you have that custom dependency and then connected, because otherwise Vue has a tendency to delete nodes that are not connected as of version 8. So if you're version 7 user, you can pretty much leave whatever you want in the graph or in the function for the terrain, and it won't get deleted. But in Vue 8, you got to be wary, because it will get deleted. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. Now we're going to move over to the material, where I just loaded in the brown sand preset from material layers. And since I'm working with this type of terrain, what I did was I went to the effects tab and turned the contrast up, which adjusts the smoothness of the shader. It's kind of like a Phong angle. And since the mesh itself doesn't have the ability to adjust that smoothing angle, we have to do it with the shader, or with the material. So if I turn this back to the default, which is, I believe, around 11, and if we take a look at the render, and in this case it really doesn't look too bad. I do have a softness turned on for the sunlight in the shadows. But sometimes you'll notice around these edges, or where the more vertical angles are, that there's really kind of weird things going on with the way the shading is. So what I did was just increase that to 50, and that gives us a much finer edge. It defines the area a lot more, really shows the shape of the object much more. You can already see that instead of being extremely smooth, it's now going to be flatter on the bottom and a little more for what I was looking for. So now we're going to go over to add in the ecosystem layer. We're going to add the ecosystem, and I'm going to change this over to object parametric because I do want to match the output and make it equal to the mapping mode of the procedural terrain, which, if I go ahead and edit it, we can see is object parametric with a scale set to 1. So I'm just keeping those the same just to make sure nothing goes wrong. So now what we can do is start adding the different plants to the population. I'm just going to go through and add in the different flowers that are available. We might need to make some scale changes because this scene is not to scale. This flower box is enormous. But what we can do is just go through and keep adding in, and now the more we add, the more of that noise we're going to be able to fill in with more variations. So you can use any flowers that you want, plants, anything, objects, rocks. And instead of controlling the presence by just kind of a random amount or typing in less of one and just kind of having it distributed randomly, we're going to control it with a function. But first, I need to define the scale. I'm going to start by changing the overall scaling to 2 and changing every single scale of each of the objects to 10, just because I know a lot of them are going to be way too small otherwise. Go back to scaling, change it to 1, and some may need to be reduced. Some might be larger than the others, but we'll see that. So I'm going to go over to General and drive with function, distribution. Add in input node, external dependency, and now we can select the terrain from the list and that custom dependency, and whatever we had it named. I didn't save the changes I made when I closed up the terrain editor, so it is still called the default of custom dependency. So now we can connect the distribution to that external dependency. We just want to take a look at the output range. It doesn't look like anything's really extending up to 1. And we do want to make sure that we have a full range, otherwise we're going to be leaving out some of those objects. Now, that is technically a way to create a null, and there are ways to create patches by using larger objects that are null. So I'll just leave it for the moment just so I can demonstrate that. It's kind of cool. Increase the density. And what I want is just kind of level these out a bit. So some of these objects will need to be scaled. Looks like the Bonnie clump needs to come down to about 5. And the primrose, we'll go ahead and leave that. The yellow flowers, looks like it's okay. These top 2 shouldn't be showing. And right now, actually, the presence is not showing correctly in this list. It's not giving us the number output. We need to control them. So I'm just going to click OK to close that out. Go back, edit the material, and now we're going to see the range for each of these different objects. So it is divided equally, -1 to 1. So over a range of a number of 2, we divide it by the number of items in the population list, and then offset them 1 by 1. Now, because we do have the function containing, or the list containing items that are not being driven by the function because they're not in range, what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and increase the yellow flower scale to 50 and populate. Now what you can see is you don't see any flowers that are a scale of 50, but you see a huge reduction in the spacing between the other objects. Because by placing an item within a kind of a void area that's not going to show up in the population, we can basically create a null object to distribute spacing, and in a way kind of clump things together. So it is kind of a neat thing you can do. You don't necessarily have to use an actual plant or a real object. Sometimes what I'll do is just load in a single polygon or a point from another program as an object, and we can use that. The only thing is, if it doesn't have any actual scale, it doesn't always work. So it really depends on the situation. Sometimes you could just use a basic Vue sphere. If you want to have a null object like that, you just got to make sure that the presence is not going to show up within the range, in this case 0.71 to 1. So since the function is not outputting that scale or that number, we're not going to see this item. But it does create a nice little spacer, and we can even take it down the other direction and scale it down to 1, which is now really going to clump things together much closer. So it's kind of a neat thing, a nice little extra control. But let's go ahead and open it up so we can actually see that item. So what we need to do, and actually it looks like just about everything below or above 0.5 isn't in the list, so it looks like the orange flowers may not be showing up. So what I'm going to do is use the map filter, and we can just kind of clip the range. We want to make sure the lower value of the output range is -1, and then we just need to bring down the upper value. So what I could do is set this to 0.5, and if we're still not quite reaching the top, and it looks like we are, just hitting it with 0.5. I'm not going to worry about clipping the out-of-range values, although we can, to be sure that nothing outside of range is showing. But by looking at the extension with the automatic extension on, if it is not higher than 1, then we know we haven't gone out of range. So if I set this to 0.4, or let's say 0.2, turn off clip out of range, we can see 1.48. So I'm going completely out of range and cutting off a whole bunch of objects. Go back to 0.5, we can see that it's returned to 1. So 0.4 sets to 1.12. Now I know it's a little hard for you to see. It's a very small number, and it's kind of grayed out. But you could just pay attention to that in the function node preview. So let's set that to 0.5. Go ahead and clip it just to make sure. And set that yellow flower scale back to 10. Now we can populate, and we're going to start to see those yellow flowers showing. So go ahead and bring that down to 5, because it looks like those are a little bit larger. All the new flowers seem to be a bit larger than the old ones. And we may need to reduce some additional scales. Bonnie clump might go down to 4. So you could just go around and scale that. I'm going to increase the density a very high amount. And now I am getting a lot of population around the rim and the edges. So if I do want to get rid of that, because it is still a bit of a slope, one thing we can do is reduce the slope range in which the population exists. And we should be able to knock it out by doing that. If we're removing too much from the bottom, we can just adjust the altitude range, reducing from the top. Although I will admit this isn't exactly the most reliable method, because the way the scale is returned from a procedural terrain, it is well beyond the range that's actually showing in the scene. And as you can see, I can type in -0.99 populate, and we only have a 0.1 altitude range to work with. So it does make it a little difficult. You can set it to the absolute range if needed, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're working with the object parametric mode. But that's just to get, of course, that material back and forth. And that's just really in this situation. You don't exactly have to do that with your own scenes. And it does look like it was the colorful Bonnies that was completely out of place, and not the Bonnie Club, although the material was still showing up about the same in the OpenGL. So I did just go ahead and fix that. Another thing you could do is increase the sampling quality if needed to better conform to the slope range or altitude range and fill things in a little better. I'm going to turn off the decay near foreign objects. But this gives us a nice little way to control presence. And I'm going to go back, increase the overall scale. We'll set it to 1.5. So now if we want more variation, we need to add in additional flowers. And then for the distribution and the presence noise that's it's generating this, a really simple thing you can do is if we go to the function and the external dependency, we can set up a blend between these two. And set up a blender and a blender back to the exact same function. We're going to add, and then I'm going to add in another filter, set it to offset, which will allow us to lift it up or lower the entire material or the entire function. Type 0.35. It doesn't have to be a perfect amount. Now when we do that, we are going to have to readjust the clipping. So you may have to go higher than before or lower. So you may have to go in both directions. But that way you can get even more variation than you had before, which is pretty cool. And we just need to adjust that. So depending on the offset you have, you can also match the offset. So technically this would be negative 1.35. Should give us the same value as before, but with some additional range. Now we don't really have enough objects within the population to fill all this in. We should see a slight change, not much. So as I add in more objects to the population list, it will start to fill in those additional values. And you could just keep offsetting and adding more and more. Just make sure that the final output range is between -1 and +1. And there's some really cool stuff you can do with presence because of that.